Welcome to the Culture and Leadership Connections podcast. If your job involves working with or influencing people's behavior, this podcast offers invaluable insights into what makes people tick. Through personal interviews that are thoughtful and surprising, we explore the full range of the roots to people smarts that can help you make or break your own career. My name is Marie Gervais, and with a PhD in culture and learning in the workplace and my own cultural journey, I bring the mysteries of human beings at work around the world to you. Through conversations with very diverse people, examining the groups they were born into and the ones they chose to belong to, my podcast takes a deep dive into why people do what they do and how they belong. Hone your skills to manage others and to be a better human being at work with the Culture and Leadership Connections podcast. And now for today's episode. Hello, Culture and Leadership Connections podcast listeners. Today, I have a most interesting guest who I can hardly wait to interview. Her name is Dimple Dhabalia, and she is the founder of Roots in the Clouds, a boutique consulting firm specializing in using the power of story to heal individual and organizational trauma and moral injury, something I'm going to be asking her about. She's also a writer, podcaster, coach, and facilitator with over 20 years of public service experience, working at the intersection of leadership, mindful awareness, and storytelling. Her path to becoming a leader of leaders was a circuitous one, unfolding over the course of almost 2 decades of living, working, and traveling in more than 40 countries, serving the most vulnerable people in the world. With both the empowering and challenging experiences from her career as a catalyst, Dimple launched Roots in the Clouds in 2021 with the personal mission of transforming mission-driven sectors by building human-centered cultures that are able to meet mission needs and create psychologically safe spaces. You can find her 2 podcasts, Service Without Sacrifice and What Would Ted Lasso Do, wherever you listen to your podcasts. And all of her social media links will be in the show notes. So welcome, Dimple. Lovely to have you here on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
I am really interested in your story. How did you get started? You must have been born somewhere and you have a family. Give the listeners a little bit of a personal insight into who you are.
So I was born in the United States, but I was the daughter of first-generation immigrants. My dad had been born and raised in India, and he had come to the U.S. in the late 60s to get his master's in engineering. And my mom was actually born and raised in East Africa, in Uganda. And she and her family left right before Idi Amin started to expel all the Indian people out of Uganda. But 2 of my uncles ended up as refugees coming out of there. And so my mom had only been in India for maybe a little over a year when she met my dad, who was back on what I call the marriage tour. And they met for about 30 minutes, during which time my dad said, I live in America. I love America. If we get married, we'd be living in America. And, I talked to my mom about that many years later. I was like, how would you just, choose to marry someone who was going to take you that far away? And her reasoning was, number one, he seemed kind, but also that India didn't feel like home to her. And so for her, she didn't think that it would be that big of a difference to go from India to America. And so they ended up on the East Coast. And then I was born in Chicago. And within a year, my dad had gotten a job after finishing his master's. So we moved to Denver. And that's pretty much where I grew up for a pretty good chunk of my life. And I had a younger sister there. And then for part of the time, we lived in Southern California as well, before moving back to Denver, where I finished out high school and then went on to college, also in the Midwest, and then also Oxford University, followed by law school, which I'm kind of laughing or smiling right now because I went to law school right out of college because I thought it was the easier path, because I had a professor who kept insisting that I could move to Washington, D.C. and that I'd, be fine. I'd land on my feet. And coming from the background that I did, going without a plan was not really an option. And so law school was kind of my easy path. And I think really set me up for where I ended up going career-wise later. But right out of law school, I ended up with a job at the Attorney General's office in Colorado, where I was one of just a handful of attorneys representing the State Department of Human Services. So we represented the state in issues of abuse and neglect when people were being listed on the state central registry for child protection. And from there, I ended up moving back to California and started at a private firm that was a terrible fit. And within months, I was looking for other work and ended up landing on the announcement for an asylum officer in the federal government. And as I read the description, it looked like my dream job on paper. So I left work early that day, went home. It was the last day of the posting as well. So I worked on my application for about 7 or 8 hours and literally submitted it around 11:58 p.m. before it closed. And then it was silence for about 3 months, and I had no idea if I got the job or not. But about 3 months later, they reached out and just offered me the job. And it turned out that they were actually looking for attorneys because they felt like we had the right skill set to adjudicate these cases. And so from there, I started out interviewing asylum seekers who had come to the US claiming persecution on account of their race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. And it was amazing. I really was so grateful for the opportunity to be a witness to the stories I was hearing. And then it was my job to assess, what they had told me, determine if the country conditions supported what they had said, kind of determine their credibility in the story that they told me, and then ultimately make a decision. And so as I was doing this job and moving up through the ranks, I started getting opportunities to go overseas to interview refugees out in the field. So people who were in refugee camps or who had found other cities abroad that they were living in. And yeah, it was just really, really incredible work. And it was really hard work. And about 6 or 7 years into my career, I was on assignment in Zambia, and I was really struggling. And I couldn't contain myself in interviews anymore. As applicants were telling me their story, I was crying. Like, I had really taken pride in this wall of professionalism that I kind of had created for my career. And so usually I could interview people and, not have any expression, but to really kind of be able to just do that without getting emotional about it. And so in Zambia, that all was changing and I was really struggling. And after work, if I went back to my hotel, I could not sleep. If I did sleep, I was having really, really terrible nightmares, reliving the experiences that I had heard about during the day.
You were traumatized.
Oh, for sure.
Over and over again,
yes.
Without realizing it until it tipped you over the edge.
Yes. And as a result, it was also going to the bar a lot more and things like that, not very healthy behaviors. The only good thing was that when I had been at the Attorney General's office, I had a really wonderful boss. And because of the nature of the work we were doing there, he understood this concept of vicarious trauma, right? So the trauma that we are taking on, that doesn't necessarily belong to us, right? And so he had us go through a training. And as a young attorney, I remember thinking, why do we need this? I'm fine. I don't need this. But it planted a seed, and that seed kind of came to fruition again about 10 years after the fact. So 6 years into my new career. And I realized, okay, I think this is what I'm experiencing, but there was such a stigma, and there continues to be such a stigma around mental health, especially in the workplace. And with us in the government, we had security clearances and things like that. And so there was so much misinformation about what it meant if you were going to go to therapy or things like that and how it might impact your security clearance. So nobody talked about these things. And so for quite a while, I tried to figure out how to handle it on my own. And I finally kind of had this realization one day where I thought, if I'm experiencing this, I can't be the only one. Others must be experiencing this too. And at that time, I was living and working in Greece. And so I was going on these assignments out of Greece. And so when I rotated back from my assignment in Greece back to the US, I landed in a position where I had a bit of a platform. It was a leadership position. And so I really started advocating for, we really need to start talking about occupational mental health traumas or challenges, just to normalize them a bit, for people to understand that when we're doing this kind of work of serving other humans, it's messy. Being human is messy, serving humanity is messier, and we need to be able to talk about it. And so I started advocating from within, and then starting to educate our workforce on these concepts of vicarious trauma, secondary traumatic stress, and then providing them with, here are some things you can do in terms of self-care and whatnot when you're out in the field.
I imagine you did some things yourself to heal as well.
I did. A lot of what I started focusing on was mindfulness based. So really learning to tune in, focusing on things like my breath, creating, concentration to be with the pain rather than trying to,
Take on the
yeah,
pain. Yeah.
yeah,
Like not be a sponge.
exactly.
Yeah. But even just
Exactly.
being with the pain is, you still need to discharge it afterwards.
Exactly. Exactly.
Mhm.
But, you have to feel it in order to heal it and let go. As I started learning this, I started studying things like applied positive psychology and understanding things like gratitude, practice of gratitude, practice of self-compassion, and how these things can help us begin to create new neural pathways and start shifting how we're thinking and how we are showing up in these spaces to create empathy rather than, like you said, taking in other people's trauma and then not being able to let go of it. And I didn't realize really honestly until I started writing my book that every time I interviewed somebody, I was actually a lot of my own trauma from childhood was being mirrored back to me. And
Right.
so
Right.
right? So a lot of the experiences that the refugees were having around displacement, around violence, around mental health, these were things I had experienced in my childhood in America. And I didn't recognize that it wasn't just that I was listening to their stories, but I was reliving my own trauma every day over and
Right.
over again.
Right.
Yeah,
And just reinforcing those neural pathways constantly.
exactly.
Hmm.
Exactly. Yeah.
Let me go back a little bit to your childhood since you mentioned it. It could be any memory that just pops up, but what childhood experience do you feel has been formative for you for your sense of culture and leadership and your direction in your life? It can be positive, it can be difficult, whatever stands out in your mind.
I think there were a couple things. So this idea of othering and belonging has been a big theme in my life. And so when I was 3, it was Easter and I was really excited about Easter. I was excited about the Easter bunny and all kinds of things. And well, I shouldn't say obviously, but my family was Hindu. So we were not Christian. But like so many other people, we celebrate all these holidays for the kind of connection and community around it. And so on Easter, I came downstairs, I was looking out the window, and I saw that there was like these shiny eggs, hidden in our front yard. And so I got so excited. I grabbed my Easter basket, dumped out everything that was in it, and ran out the front door and started collecting the eggs. And I had collected about 4 or 5. And all of a sudden, one of my neighbors was standing in the yard and, looking down at me, asking me what I thought I was doing. And I was excited. I was like, oh my gosh, the Easter bunny came and I'm collecting eggs. And my dad had been watching from the window. So he came out and asked if everything was okay. And she said it was not, and that these eggs were for the neighborhood children. And so my dad kind of looked at her with this quizzical face.
Yeah,
And
like, are you not one of the neighborhood children sort of thing?
exactly, exactly. And so then she clarified that it's for the Christian children in the neighborhood.
Hmm.
And I was too young really to understand why my dad then made me put all the eggs back and why I had to basically sit at my window and watch all the neighborhood kids then run around the neighborhood collecting eggs. And that was really formative because it was kind of my first experience of othering. And then I experienced a lot of that and other like kind of microaggressions or subtle acts of exclusion throughout my education and things that I didn't understand, like terminology that was used. So I had a classmate call me an Indian giver once because I changed my mind about giving her like one of my favorite pencils. And when I went to and when she said that to me, I thought she was talking about me as someone from India. And I went to tell my teacher, and instead of reprimanding the person, she kind of laughed and then told me that it wasn't nice to go back on my word, and I had to apologize for that.
No, it's like a double whammy because it's a racist slur against Indigenous people, and
Mm-hmm.
then it's being used incorrectly to you, and the teacher
Exactly.
didn't correct both of those mistakes.
Exactly. And so there were incidents like that throughout. And I think it made me, number one, feel like I didn't belong. But for the rest of my life, it kind of forced me to hide away parts of myself for decades in an effort to fit in. And so I worked so much harder to prove to people that I was worthy of being there, that I was worthy of belonging. And then the other thing that really, I think, made a big impact was we definitely had a lot of like mental health. My dad had bipolar disorder, and that impacted us immensely growing up because I think I was about 7 when he first got sick. And that was before he was diagnosed as bipolar. But after that, it really kind of disrupted our lives in that, my mom was constantly trying to make sure that he was going to be okay. But the other piece of this was that the expectations that were placed on me and my sister as kind of what I call third culture children, we didn't quite belong in America, but we also didn't belong when we'd go to India. But the expectations of my dad is when I was very little, he used to say my prayers with me. So starting when I was like 1 or 2 years old. And so he would recite it in Gujarati and I would recite after him. And it was basically, "Dear God, please make me good and wise. Please let me be educated and successful. Please give me common sense and values. And please make me a doctor or engineer."
And you should have the highest marks in the class all the time, no matter what.
Yes.
Even if your
Yes.
teacher's prejudice against you.
Exactly. And so, so his vision was pretty clear, but it was really complicated for us because we were now growing up where the customs and the language and everything were different. And the values of what was important in school was different than what he had grown up with. So, I really believe like my parents had good intentions and they were doing their best, but the social implications of their decisions, they really impacted us in a lot of ways.
There really needs to be a kind of an education for immigrant parents about what to expect in a school system when they move to another country and how this is different from what they would have experienced back home. Because no matter what country you immigrate to, the school system that you experience is never what your parents think. And they don't change that even after many years of seeing that the system is different. You have these disconnects constantly. You're trying to make everybody happy. And how can you find out really what matters to you and what you're good at when you're in the middle of all of this pleasing game? How did you negotiate that?
Well, I think the other piece of that is, at least what I found in my community, was that all the parents who came over for their education, they were kind of stuck in this weird place because they were operating off of the culture and values that they had left, right? And so they didn't see what was changing after they left.
Right.
And so that was the other piece of it. But in terms of navigating it, it was hard. There was a lot of feeling like I always had to be the best. And so working very hard to get good grades, memorizing everything I could all the time, studying all the time. But then there was also a lot of resentment as a result because I would see my friends, doing things that I would want to do. When I was in high school, this was at a point where my dad's mental health had really declined. We had to actually institutionalize him. And my mom was working 8 hours a day at a bakery. Then she'd come home and then we'd have these catering orders. And I was expected to help with the catering orders. And I remember we had this one that was massive. And I was sitting with like a pile of garlic in front of me, just like smashing these garlic heads. And I was so angry because my friends were all going out on a Friday night. And here I was crushing garlic and, spending the whole rest of my weekend working to help my mom get this order done, which, I then would feel guilty about because there was this sense of like family and this sense of contributing. And, and that was all very like culturally instilled, right? That this is what you do.
And you knew that you were contributing to the family and that it was useful and that necessary. And and at the same time, you're also learning a lot of skills that you could use afterwards, but feeling like, do I ever have a choice in anything must have been hard.
Yeah, it was definitely challenging.
Maybe say a little bit about what you think you took away from that was helpful and something that maybe was not so helpful.
Yeah, so I think what was really helpful is I think spending so much of my life trying to figure out how I belong. I think that's actually ultimately what led me to become more of a human-centered leader and to advocate for human-centered leadership in organizations, because at the heart of human-centered leadership is empathy, connection, and belonging. And so I think that these experiences really made me want to make sure that the people around me never felt that way and that they always felt like they belonged. And so I think that was definitely a positive that came out of this. In terms of like the mental health issues, and then even with being the third culture child, I think they both led me to hide behind a mask of perfectionism for a very, very long time. And that is a very difficult, unsustainable way of living. And I think many of us do it, right? We want to show that we are okay. We want to show that our life is great. And so I really hid behind that for such a long time. But I think the exposure to trauma, so the mental health, the domestic violence, the displacement in the younger years of my childhood, they left me kind of craving safety and security, stability. And so I think the good thing to come out of that then was that every time we were kind of forced to leave. So when we would try to get away from my dad, which happened a few times, it forced me to grow up and take responsibility at an early age. And it created, lots of chaos and displacement, but it also made it so that I wasn't afraid of change. I actually kind of looked at each of those opportunities as a way to kind of reinvent myself and show up and, do better from what I had learned in the last experience. And so I think in my leadership, it's kind of bled over in terms of I feel like there's always opportunities to like change and grow and do things better in a way that is going to serve us better. And so I think that kind of came out of those experiences as well. And all of this ultimately, I just want to create that sense of safety and security for the people that I'm leading or the organizations that I'm helping, because as human beings, that's all we're looking for, right? We're hardwired for that need for safety and security.
Yeah, that's how we can show our true colors and be at our best.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes people confuse a lack of safety with a toughening up, but I don't think that applies at all. When you experience hardship in your life and you learn to overcome it and you seek to remedy a situation, and when you see that there's some relief on the horizon, you learn from that hardship. But for someone on the outside, creating an unsafe environment for you, it doesn't help at all. It doesn't,
No.
It just shuts you down and it's hard to get over it afterwards.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about from your parents' cultures and from growing up in the US, what are some things that you took with you culturally that you think are still an important part of who you are?
Yeah. So I think one of the bigger things was becoming, I think, like a high performing leader. So again, I think that in a way has served me very well. Like I've gone to the highest ranks, when I was in my organization. And I'm grateful for that because it opened up so many doors and led to so many incredible things. But again, going back to part of getting into that group and being a part of that was, it was shaped by those expectations. It was shaped by othering. And it led to this professional mask of perfectionism. It led to this work ethic and this idea, especially within this kind of mission-driven space of service before self. And that was challenging. And I think that became everything for me, that when I watched my mom not only working as hard as she did, but also we had kind of a meditation community that we belonged to. And so her service to them as well on top of everything else. So there was always this feeling of, and then just how she took care of us, that we are meant to serve others before we take care of ourselves. And what's interesting is in the last couple of years before she passed away, we talked about this a lot, and she had really changed her view on this. And that was helpful to hear, that she wanted my sister and I to take care of ourselves first. She wanted us to rest. She wanted us to do the things we needed to so we could show up and actually be the best versions of ourselves. And so that's been a really powerful shift in my life, is this idea of service without sacrifice. And so I don't want to sacrifice my health, well-being, relationships in the name of serving other people who need my help. Because what I've learned is that I can't be very good at what I'm doing if I'm exhausted, if I'm burned out, if I'm traumatized. And so I have to take care of myself.
The other thing with putting yourself out there for other people, although it's really important to do that, and I would say in an individualistic North American culture, not enough people have a sense of service and its value for being a complete human being. But on the other side, is it can become a form of martyrdom, which is harmful. Or it can be that you feel you're wearing some kind of a badge of honor when you suffer for others, and then you don't allow them to build their capacity because you hold them back, both through guilting them with martyrdom, and you also hold them back from developing their own capacity because they just can't. They're just stuck in your box of who they should be. It's paternalism when you think about it, It's like, I'll keep you small so that you can still need me, and I'm still the be-all and the end-all in your life. And that is not a healthy adult-child relationship to have.
No, it definitely isn't. And so that's in the family context. But, I talk about in my work these martyrdom cultures because we create entire cultures based in this martyrdom where there's this feeling like, if not me, then who? Right? Like, who else is going to be able to do this? Well, guess what? When you can no longer function and you have a health issue, somebody will step in. And so we have to change that belief for ourselves and understand that And to your point, that if only one person is doing everything in an organization, it fails the organization too, because
Yep.
if they do get harmed or hurt or burned out or sick or whatever, everybody's left kind of flailing and not sure, what did they do? How did they do that? And so there is this sense of like, we need to, number one, normalize these very real kind of impacts of the work, but also stop creating these cultures where we celebrate people overworking and we celebrate people barely sleeping. And it's not doing the individual any good. It's not doing the organization any good. And it's certainly not doing the people that they are trying to serve any good.
Yeah, it's depleting your capacity to make a good judgment. You're tired and exhausted and sick, and you aren't making good decisions. You can't even respond to yourself. So whatever you see on the outside is going to be incorrect because it's going to be whatever you're projecting onto the outside. So you're not helping anybody that way, even though you think you are.
Exactly.
So when you moved, into all of these new understandings and you moved around and have worked in different countries and you've seen lots and lots of people in very difficult situations, have you also seen things that you loved and that you might have wanted to keep as part of your own cultural understandings?
Yeah. I mean, I have to say that, I think one of the biggest gifts of interviewing refugees was just understanding the resilience of the human spirit.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, these were people who had lost everything and who had experienced the most unimaginable things. And yet, they continue to move forward. They continue to try to fight and figure out how to live a better life and create a better life for their kids. And I just found that really inspiring. And it put a lot of stuff into perspective, right? I mean, so the things that were happening in my life, and this is one thing I really caution against, is I don't think that, especially as people working in service of others, we should never compare our lives or our traumas or our hardship to the people we're serving, because it's all relative. But having said that, I did find it gave me some perspective sometimes when I was stuck in a place where I was feeling sorry for my life or feeling like, I can't believe this happened to me. It helped to get me unstuck so I could continue moving forward. And I found that to be very, very inspiring and helpful.
So it's more of a gratitude and also mindset piece that allowed you to move forward from that. So if you had lived in a country for a while because you worked or studied there rather than interviewing refugees, you would have experienced the culture differently.
Well, and I did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you did live there, but it's still you're living. I don't know how you were living. Tell me how you were living.
Yeah. So, for example, when I lived in Greece, I was actually posted there for 3 years.
I see. Mm-hmm.
And that was incredible too, because what I learned from that posting was people in Greece, their work was not their life. They would come to work every day, they would do their work, and then they'd leave. And during the day, they would take their breaks and they would actually go and sit and have lunch and they would talk to other people. And even during the height of austerity, all the Greek cafes were always full because people understood the importance of connection and it wasn't just about work. And so the 3 years I lived there, I mean, my quality of life was incredible. I had such an amazing social circle, a social network. I was never tired. I had so much energy and I was able to serve in a way that was really healthy, except for when I then went to Zambia. And then that started that whole chain of events with the vicarious trauma being triggered. But I had a very different experience a few years later when I was posted in New Delhi. So I was out there as the field office director, and it was the height of the global refugee crisis. And so I was traveling a lot within my region. So in New Delhi, my office covered 8 countries. And so we would travel regionally to interview refugees, and then also just all the general immigration stuff that we did in New Delhi. I was managing the largest office we had abroad. And because of the way things were set up, I was not allowed to delegate my duties of reviewing cases and things like that. So I still was responsible for doing all of that and traveling out to these different countries for 2 weeks at a time. So basically, I was working all the time, where I would be in New Delhi, I'd be reviewing cases all day, I'd be prepping for my next trip, I'd be preparing my team for the next trip, and then I would travel out. And while I was gone, somebody in my office would manage the office, and I'd have an officer who was there to conduct interviews and things like that. But all their cases that they interviewed would then come to and sit on my desk until I got back. And because I was traveling so much, I didn't have any social connections in country, and it was incredibly challenging. And then on top of that, I got sick within a couple of months of getting in country. And I ignored it, and I think that's the other part of all of this is when we start to notice, like our thoughts, we start to notice how our body's responding, all these things, we can make changes, but inevitably we backslide. And New Delhi was a big backslide for me. And so when we do, this is why I really feel like self-compassion is so important, because when we backslide, it's about recognizing our humanity, recognizing we're not perfect, and then getting ourselves back in that place to start over again. And so, so my experience in New Delhi was very different and it was not as great, but it helped me get back to that place of understanding that I can't work this way. Like I have to be able to take breaks. I have to be able to have community. I have to be able to be in a space where I am a whole human being and that whole human being is recognized as a whole human being.
When you contrast your Greece example with your New Delhi, India example, it shows how easy it is for us to fall in with whatever is there. You're right there, and it's like, it feels like there should be breaks and people should rest and everyone's doing it. And so that's what we do. And then when the opposite happens, that's what we do. And that process of reflecting, is that what I should be doing, doesn't happen until later. But you had a chance to do that because of the contrast of the two examples.
Yes, I did.
What about personality? So people are born with temperament. That remains fairly unchangeable. Then, of course, you have the nature-nurture piece, which grows out of that. And then you move into adding on through experience and either overcoming or not overcoming challenges that come your way. And that becomes part of your personality. What would you say you were born with temperament-wise, and what have you added on or adopted personality-wise?
Yeah, I think my temperament was kind of based in empathy and caring for sure. And also wanting to kind of fight injustice. Like that's something that's really important to me from the very beginning. And then I think what I've added to that is self-care, learning to be curious over judgmental. And starting to like recognize that there may be other things happening for people that go beyond what we see on the surface. But have you ever seen that picture of the sculpture, or maybe you've seen the sculpture itself, where there's two people sitting back to back with their inner children kind of reaching for one another?
Yes.
I think that is such a perfect description of how I see the world. Like, I really think I tend to see the world through this lens of a lot of people who are just wanting love and belonging. And there's a lot of nervous systems in need of being regulated.
No kidding.
And so this is how I tend to move through the world now, is when I see or experience like a challenging situation, that's my first thought is what happened to this person or what's happening to them now. And so for me, I think when I experienced my own kind of those occupational mental health challenges, like vicarious trauma and moral injury, my initial kind of gut reaction was this feeling of shame and there's something wrong with me. But once I started to think about like, no, it can't be just me. There's more people around me that are experiencing this too. I went into this advocacy mode. And I think that's another part of who I've been from the beginning is I've never been afraid to kind of speak truth to power. And so I've always been open to having those conversations with leaders above me and things like that. And I think that that's worked out not only for me, but for the people around me, because it's allowed me to advocate from within in a lot of situations. And so through that process, I was able to create a program that focused on workforce health and well-being within our organization. And I also launched what I called the Daring Leaders Project, which was kind of the first leadership development program based in mindfulness and positive psychology within my organization. And because we launched right before the pandemic, we were actually able to see the impact of that program on the teams that were led by people who went through our program versus teams that were not. And it was really incredible because everything that we were doing was around building this sense of connection and belonging and psychological safety, and really making sure that the leaders were leaning into curiosity and they were learning to see their people as whole human beings. And it was incredible. It was really, really incredible.
Yeah, such a protection for the pandemic and other things that come up, to have that kind of training and self-awareness where you just learn this ability to tune into yourself and see what's going on and tune into what's going on around you without just reacting all the time. So many of the problems we have in the world are just one reaction after another. It's like a whole series of firecrackers going off, isn't it?
Exactly. Exactly. You know, it's interesting that you start with talking about the stories that, what I call in my book, I call it the stories that shape us. And then the next thing is about the survival reactions. And that's exactly right. That because we go through life on autopilot for so much of our life, we don't recognize that these are patterns that we keep repeating. And these are our go-to survival reactions, and that those can be changed so that we can actually make intentional responses instead of just reacting.
Mm-hmm. I think the work you're doing is very important.
Thank you.
Tell me a little bit about what you see as being a moral injury. Vicarious trauma, I think people have heard for a while, but moral injuries, other than me, you're the only other person that's ever said that word exactly like that, like those two words, moral injury. So I'm really interested in what that means to you.
Yeah. So for people who don't know, moral injury originally came about when soldiers were returning from combat, and the impact that war and combat had had on them in terms of like PTSD type symptoms and things like that, because they were being asked to do things that went against their own deeply held morals and beliefs. And what I found interesting is around the time that Donald Trump came into power here in the US, I started doing a lot of trainings in-house on things like resilience, post-traumatic growth, things like that. And it was during that time that I kind of put those pieces together where I realized that what I personally was experiencing in terms of this feeling of being depressed, not super excited about the work, but also just feeling so conflicted every day because, and especially my program, the asylum and refugee program, like we were very much in the crosshairs of that administration's policymaking. And so there was this constant feeling like, I can't keep doing this. Like I can't show up and enforce policies that I feel so morally opposed to. And then the conflict kicked in, which was, but if I leave, I don't know who's going to come in and what they will then do. And so I was talking to so many other colleagues in public service, and many people were feeling the same way, that there was this desire to leave, but then this fear of what's going to happen if we do. And it's not unique to those of us who didn't agree with that administration. You know, there were plenty of people who experienced something similar when President Obama was in office. And so this is what's been interesting for me, and what I have been writing about more is that in public service, there's an expectation that you're supposed to be apolitical. You're signing up to enforce the laws and policies of whatever administration is in power. And so if you stay in public service long enough, at some point, you're going to end up working for someone with whom you deeply, deeply disagree. And so how do we navigate that? And how is that impacting our mental health, right? How is that impacting our well-being in the workforce? And so I started talking about that. I was really nervous about talking about it. And what I found was that people were reaching out to me and they're like, everything you're describing is what I'm experiencing. And now I have a word for it. Now I have a term for it. And so again, I think this is another area where we don't acknowledge how serving humanity actually impacts us when the policies associated with the service conflict with our own morals and beliefs. And so we also saw this during the pandemic in the medical industry, you know, with doctors and nurses in terms of, you know, how they were expected to work and the choices that they had to make. It was really, really deeply scarring and disturbing for people. And so I think that this is an area that is ripe for discussion now. I think we have to start to recognize that moral injury is another kind of occupational mental health issue that is arising in more and more workplaces.
When people have experienced a moral injury, which is like a wound to their values, then they lose this faith in humanity, hope for a better future, and the capacity to love others. All those things that we need to connect socially with people, they recede. Do you think I'm on the right track with this?
100%. Yeah. I think part of what draws us into these kinds of service-oriented work is connection to purpose, right? And when we start losing that hope and that faith in humanity, we also lose our connection to our purpose. And that feels terrible. It feels really terrible. And I think that that makes it really challenging. And to your point, this is kind of it's a wound on our heart.
Yeah.
And so it's not
the
visible.
Soul and body. You feel it in your body too.
Absolutely. It's not visible in the sense of like if you physically hurt yourself. And so there's that piece of it. And I think because we are not educated on this idea, and the other piece of this, honestly, is I talk about the legacy of the Industrial Revolution was that, you know, we created these workplaces that were born out of efficiency and things like that. And we want people to show up and be efficient and do their jobs. And so there's this expectation that we compartmentalize parts of our lives, right? And what I say every time I work with leaders and organizations is that we are whole human beings. We do not leave a piece of ourselves at the door when we walk into work each day.
Absolutely.
As much as we want to believe that we have the capacity to do this, we don't. And so what ends up happening is that we are moving through and all these things are weighing on us. And you're right. Our body is giving us signals constantly that there is something wrong here. This is not working for me. But we've been so conditioned to believe that we have to compartmentalize that we can't acknowledge that. And this is really what I want to see change. Like, I really think that number one, as individuals, we have to start to notice these things for ourselves and we have to start making shifts for ourselves. And we have to do that before we can actually change organizations.
Right.
But I think that within organizations, we really need to start thinking about how do we create these holistic human-centered duties of care that focus on the whole human being. And you know what's actually really funny is, well, it's not funny, but when I was writing about this, I was saying that most organizations provide a duty of care that at least focuses on the safety and security of individuals. Like, that's what they believe, that's all they're responsible for. And what I've been realizing in the last probably 6 months is that there are organizations out there that are not even doing that, that basic level. But let's say that the majority of organizations provide a duty of care based in physical safety and security. It's not enough. And so if we want to stop the outflow of people, and if we want to retain institutional knowledge, and we want to create workforces that are happy and healthy, organizations have to create a duty of care that's going to look at the needs of the whole person.
I agree. I think it's absolutely critical. And when that doesn't happen, that's when people start making mistakes in their lives that cause them their reputation for the rest of their career, because they're not caring for themselves to the point where they're really vulnerable to anybody that's going to show them some care and love, even if that person is manipulative.
It's very true.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about cultural dissonance. I expect you have experienced it multiple times a day for just about your whole life, but a lot of times you have a kind of an insight that comes out of a daily small thing when there's a clash in the way people do things differently than the way you expect them to do. And I was just reflecting the other day on my street where people are from all over the world. And there's an Italian family that moved in that I've been trying to become friends with. And I was thinking that the mother is very protective of her family, as if just saying hello is going to be some kind of a problem for her kids. And I was wondering why. I mean, of course, everyone's got their own inner traumas and their own situations and that sort of thing. But then I had this flashback to my own childhood when I was 5, and my mother had to put this protective wall around us. It stopped after age 6 and going to school, but I was invited to this birthday party at an Italian family who owned a pasta factory. My parents were immigrants from other countries, not from Italy. And so, I'd never had pizza before. I'd never smelled Parmesan cheese, or I'd never even had pasta before. Like, all of that stuff was completely different to me. So I went to this birthday party and I saw that everything was different and the food was different and the smell of it was completely different. And I just had a complete panic attack and charged out of the house. And then I was thinking, that experience when I was 5, that might be what this mother experiences now with her children.
Yeah.
And I just had this sudden sense that feeling of strangeness and not knowing how to negotiate a new reality, because it felt so new to me, must be how she's feeling now. And I had this renewed sense of empathy. I thought I would throw that out to you, because I think you have a very sophisticated response to cultural difference that most of the people I interview can't even imagine. So what's your experience of cultural dissonance that jumps out when I probe it?
The thing that comes to mind as you're telling your story is I remember being a child. I must have been 5 or 6, and I was in the Brownies, so that's like the Girl Scouts here.
Yep.
And I guess the troop leaders had planned to kidnap all the girls in their pajamas and surprise them with breakfast at McDonald's. And that morning, it was a Saturday morning, and my mom just she kept coming in my room and she was, come on, you have to get up. You have to get up. And normally, on Saturdays, I would get up to watch cartoons and things like that, but it was pretty early and she had me up. She made me take a shower, get ready. She put my hair in, these tight braids and put me in a dress. And when the troop leaders showed up, all the girls were in this van in their pajamas, their hair all messed up, still half asleep. And then here was me in this dress, all hair in braids. And I'm sure there was an awkward exchange at that moment with the troop leader, but my mom was totally unbothered, because to her, she was horrified at the thought that her children would go out of the house unwashed or unkempt or in their pajamas. That was not something you did. And so we had a lot of these kinds of situations growing up. And my mom and I laughed about them when I got older. And, I am so in awe of her because she came to this country when she was 19 years old. And, at the time, there were really no Indian stores and she had to figure things out. And she did, and she did her best and she kept us alive. She kept us safe. She kept food on the table for all of us and kept a roof over our heads. And so I'm so in awe of how she was able to do all of that in light of these cultural things that she didn't necessarily understand or notice. And it's pretty incredible. And now they're kind of these funny stories. But of course, at the time, it was a little bit like, wait, why am I all dressed up? And so
that's a great example.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you what brings out the best in you when you're on assignment for anything, when you're working with any kind of coaching situation or with an organization, what brings out the best in you?
For me, it really is about curiosity, connection, and empathy. Like, I just really think these are the trifecta, especially having lived the life that I did, especially having had the kind of mask that I lived behind for most of my life. It was one of those things that for a long time, like, I didn't want anybody to see who I really was. And so what was interesting is that I've recently had people reading the book, and I've had friends who I knew, in college and things, reaching out and saying, oh my gosh, I had no idea that you were going through all these things when we knew each other. And I think it's such a beautiful example of you just never know what the person standing in front of you is experiencing or has experienced. And so there's this desire to just be curious and try to understand where another person might be coming from. And then in terms of empathy, when I work with leaders, a lot of times when we talk about things like empathy and vulnerability, people have a knee-jerk reaction of like, this is like too much work and I don't have time and this and that. But what I say is that we don't have to do anything special to convey empathy. Empathy is being in the space with the person. And you and I know that with the mirror neurons in our brain, like, we mirror what the other person is experiencing. And that creates this sense of comfort. And we can do that without taking on their hardship, without taking on their trauma. And it's just about kind of being with them in this space. And a really good friend of mine, she calls it creating a ministry of presence. And that's all it is. It's about being present with the other person and letting them know that you see them, you hear them, you value them, and that what they're experiencing is real.
Yeah.
The other thing that in terms of like with organizations, Roots in the Clouds, I created that to really explore stories because I agree with you that I think the stories are really what connect us and what help us understand each other. And I think there's ways to share stories in the workplace, but I also think that especially these days with things like equity, inclusion, belonging, and even mental health, after the pandemic, a lot of organizations being like, oh yeah, we're giving all our staff, an extra day off. And I just feel like you're putting a Band-Aid over a broken arm. It's not going to help. And I think that a big part of this is really exploring organizational trauma. And so just like we can be traumatized as individuals, the systems within which we work can be traumatized as well. And it makes sense, right? Because if we are carrying this trauma into the work that we do, we are influencing the systems as well. And so I think it's really important for organizations to understand the importance of healing root issues. Otherwise, they're going to just keep repeating the same patterns in just checking off boxes as they go.
And how are they going to do that?
And so I think, number one, acknowledging when there have been things in the past. So for example, very early on in opening my practice, I was pulled into a contract working with a government agency that had a very, very terrible history of racial inequity as an organization. And then also in terms of the people that they were serving. And they were wanting to create like this DEI plan. Partly it was because the new administration was requiring it of all government agencies. But as soon as I really started to understand what the root issues were within their organization, I was really recommending that they actually stop to, number one, acknowledge like, hey, we've had this history and, we acknowledge that it's been there. And here's how we want to do things differently this time. Even just that acknowledgement can make a huge difference.
When you acknowledge it, then you feel that you have become part of the solution. If you don't acknowledge it, you keep yourself on the outside and pretend you have some kind of high moral ground.
Exactly. And then bringing in people like me or other people who are working on organizational trauma issues to help facilitate, I call them like story healing circles. And so we can do different like themes and ideas and that kind of thing to talk through like, how has this impacted certain parts of your workforce? And understanding that just because people are expressing, the way that it's impacted them, especially if it's a negative way, it doesn't mean that you're a bad organization or that you're a terrible leader. But choosing to ignore it and choosing not to change it, that is more problematic, But if we give people the space to express themselves, to talk it through, and to bring those viewpoints into how we create new policies and procedures moving forward, like that's how you start to heal those root issues and actually create lasting, impactful change in a good way.
For sure. So here's your soapbox moment. Tell us about your book or anything else you'd like to promote.
Thank you. Yeah. So my book is available for pre-order right now, and it officially launches on February 21st, 2024. I also have a limited series podcast called Service Without Sacrifice, which launches on January 10th. I also have the other podcast, What Would Ted Lasso Do?, which explores the entire 3 seasons of Ted Lasso through the lens of leadership and positive psychology.
Oh,
yeah, which is a really fun one. I'm also in the process of starting to set up a book tour. So if there's any cities or organizations that are interested in hosting a book event, they can reach out to me at hello@rootsintheclouds.com. And then if people want more information about me, my work, or an access to a full range of resources, they can subscribe to Dear Humanitarian, which is my newsletter and content hub on Substack.
Oh, that's perfect. And for listeners, in case you didn't remember from the beginning, the name of the book is Tell Me My Story, Challenging the Narrative of Service Before Self, which I am very anxious to read. It sounds like it's going to be right up my alley.
Thank you.
Is there anything else you'd like to say before we end the interview?
I just want to say thank you for giving me the opportunity to share my story. I really do believe that sharing our stories is such a fundamental part of healing, because when our stories are witnessed by others, we feel that sense of connection and we flourish. And so I really appreciate you creating this space for curiosity and compassion and non-judgment to help others. So thank you.
It's been an honor. Thank you so much, Dimple. I'm happy to have had this time with you.
Likewise. Thank you.
Dimple Dhabalia is a humanitarian who strives to create spaces for those in service industries to be healthy, whole, and happy at work. As someone who interviewed hundreds of asylum seekers and refugees in over 40 countries, Dimple knows well what people need to flourish. Her insights are even richer in that her own childhood trauma has been reframed for post-traumatic growth. I learned a lot from my interview with Dimple and resonated personally with her stories. Her ability to apply experience to multiple contexts for healthier workplaces is nothing short of inspiring. Here are just a few of my takeaways. 1. Everyone has a story. If we seek to invite others to share their stories, we can promote collective healing. 2. Empathy comes from feeling. Feeling your own emotions is necessary to functioning effectively at work and to developing empathy towards others. As Dimple said in our interview, you have to feel it to heal it. 3. Living in different countries offers the opportunity to see how we are influenced by the societal traits around us. We take advantage of that opportunity through reflection. And 4, moral wounds happen when our values are compromised by our work conditions, colleagues, or bosses. Organizations that can recognize the pain caused by moral wounds are taking the first step towards creating psychologically safe work environments and will become leaders in workplace wellness in their field. I hope you enjoyed this episode with Dimple Dhabalia and that you will share it with a friend to help bring more people to the stories that help us all be better humans at work. Thank you for listening, and may culture and leadership connections continue to guide and inspire your journey. Newsflash: listeners can now interact with Culture and Leadership Connections podcast by leaving a voice or text message on Fan List. It is a fun and quick way to let me know what you liked, ask a question, or leave a suggestion. I will feature some of the voice messages on upcoming episodes. You might be surprised to hear your own voice, but only if you leave a message, of course. So to leave your personal message or your question, go to shiftworkplace.com/podcast and click on the fan list link to leave it. I can hardly wait to hear what you have to say.